President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd ask that the consent to vitiate the quorum call.
We are not in a quorum call. The senator is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, thank you very much. And I wanted to rise today to talk about a matter that's come before the Senate in the bill that we're considering, the United States Innovation and Competition Act. I rise to talk about a particular amendment that I've been working on. It's amendment number 1853. Of course, I urge the Senate to act quickly to improve this amendment to protect our supply chains that are critical to United States national security. I wanted to explain what the origin of this amendment has been. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the pandemic, the worst public health crisis in over 100 years in our nation. And at that time, as so many Americans remember, we watched in horror as access to masks, gloves, gowns, and even more sophisticated equipment like ventilators and other critical supplies, when all of that was necessary for pandemic response, all of a sudden it dried up. And the reason why we had such a shortage of supplies and personal protective equipment and the like was that supply chains were delayed, and those supply chains, of course, were originating in China, which we know is a country where the government is run by the Chinese Communist Party. That same ruling party and that government even tightened restrictions on the exports of masks and other personal protective equipment. So we learned the hard way, the very hard way, just how dependent our supply chains are on goods originating in China. We learned how vulnerable we all are, our nation was and is, to the Chinese government's whims, really the whim of the Communist Party in China, because it is a fact that they control the companies that produce and export the critical supplies we depend upon. This amendment, Amendment 1853, which, by the way, is bipartisan in ways that you don't see very much of in the Senate these days. 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans coming together on this bipartisan amendment. It's an effort to enhance our national security at its core. That's what it's about, enhancing our national security. But unfortunately, Mr. President, corporate forces are blocking it. They're even blocking a vote on it. They don't apparently want to see a vote on this bill. And they also don't want to include it in an agreement between both sides when the bill is about to be completed in a so-called manager's package as part of the bill. We just want to get it done because I'm interested in, and my 5 co-sponsors from both parties are interested in protecting U.S. national security. Well, we read today in a publication, Politico Pro, the Morning Trade edition. I'm just holding up a copy of it here, and I'll just make reference to it. I don't think we have to add all of it to the record. But here's the lead, the lead for Politico Pro this morning. The lead says this: trade groups representing some of the country's largest corporations are staunchly opposing a Senate proposal that would subject U.S. companies to a federal review before they can make certain investments in China or relocate critical manufacturing capabilities there. And then in the body of the report, when it gets down to reporting in detail who's opposing this amendment and what they're saying, it says that this amendment has, quote, riled up big business, unquote. Riled up big business. Just imagine that. Big corporations riled up because a bipartisan group of senators is coming together to protect national security. And they're riled up. They don't seem to support us in this. Here's what one of the the organizations that would go on the record. Of course, you have a lot of big corporations that are hiding behind trade groups, trade associations, I should say. They don't have the guts to stand up and oppose this. They're hiding behind organizations. Here's one of the organizations, and I'm quoting Anna Ashton, Vice President of Government Affairs at the U.S.-China Business Council. Here's what they have to say, quote, "We long have said that national security should not be defined in a vague way." Vague way. We're not vague in this. We're very clear. And then she goes on to criticize it. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about an effort to protect U.S. national security because, not just in the context of the pandemic, but more broadly, we've had corporations for more than a generation now offshoring work in business to China and other places. Because they're seeking cheaper production and labor costs, these companies have been moving production of manufactured goods overseas, often to China. When you move your supply chain overseas, you're at the mercy of the laws and regulations of the country you move to. And in this case, you're at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this isn't a big problem when offshoring goes to allied or liberal democracies, or allied or liberal democratic countries, but it does become a problem when the offshoring goes to foreign adversaries like China and Russia that don't play by the rules. So how do we solve the problem? How do we ensure that the panic and the powerlessness that we all experienced way back in the spring of 2020 and beyond, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? How do we make sure that the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful nation in human history, is not at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party or the Russian Federation or any other country, at their mercy, not just generally, but at their mercy for something as simple as personal protective equipment, gowns and gloves and masks? How do we make sure we're never in that predicament again? Well, one of the things we need to do is have a process to screen outbound investment. We've had for the better part of 50 years a screen for inbound investment. Okay, we've got a committee that does that since the mid-70s. All we're doing here with this amendment is putting in place an outbound investment screen. So that outbound investment screen will make sure that our national security interests are not compromised. And we don't want to create further dependency on supply chains that are located in the countries where the country is a foreign adversary. So this amendment, 1853, is modeled after legislation that I authored a few years ago, the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, where we've reintroduced a bipartisan bill with Senator Cornyn, the senior senator from Texas. I mentioned earlier that this is 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans on this amendment. Senator Cornyn, as I made reference to. Senator Stabenow, Democrat from Michigan. Senator Rubio, Republican senator from Florida. Senator Kaine, Democrat from Virginia. And Senator Tillis, Republican senator from North Carolina. They have all supported an amendment that would establish this process to screen outbound investments in the offshoring of critical supply chains to foreign adversaries like China and Russia, to ensure the resiliency of critical U.S. supply chains. It would require companies disclose before they offshore national critical capabilities to foreign adversaries, plural. So this is a common sense approach to deal with a problem that pre-existed the pandemic, but came into sharp focus when we were totally at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party. The review process is designed to identify vulnerabilities, to provide a suite of recommendations to the President, and it emphasizes remedial action such as support to domestic industries like increased research and development investment, utilization of manufacturing institutes, among others. The proposal encourages supply chain diversity, and the bill's limited in scope, only covering foreign adversaries like China and Russia. It's limited in its purview. It looks only at national critical capacities. The amendment establishes an interagency committee led by the United States Trade Representative to oversee the review process for capacities that are deemed critical, unquote, quote, critical, unquote, to U.S. national security. Now, this committee would focus on outbound investment or offshoring of these critical capacities, supply chains, domestic production and manufacturing to foreign adversaries. I would note the committee would not review outbound investments to allied countries or any country not on the affirmative list. The amendment would also establish a process to conduct ongoing evaluation of critical supply chains. In short, the amendment would ensure the United States can respond to the needs of our nation and those who may call upon us in times of crisis. But here's the problem. This common sense bipartisan amendment in a town that doesn't do a lot of bipartisanship is being opposed by corporate interests. Powerful corporate interests are opposed to this amendment and in some cases are actively working against it to shut it down. There's been a whisper campaign by corporate lobbyists to kill this bipartisan amendment that protects our national security. They're lobbying against an amendment that will ensure the U.S. has better visibility on supply chain vulnerabilities so we can respond to the needs of our nation and those who call upon us in these times of crisis. If a company wants to offshore semiconductors to China, we need to know about it, and the President could block it if that activity is a risk to national security. Yet, business interests like the United States Chamber of Commerce and the U.S.-China Business Council are organizing against this common sense proposal. And as I mentioned earlier, these group of big corporations are hiding behind their trade associations to do the work that they're doing. They're fear-mongering and they're spreading misinformation. And this effort is not surprising because often you have that in Washington. We have interests that come together even in the face of something that would help our national security. Our nation and workers pay dearly when companies prioritize their bottom line over supply chain resiliency and security. When they offshore jobs and technology to foreign adversaries like China, our country pays for that, pays dearly. I mentioned the U.S.-China Business Council and their opposition. The Association for Businesses, that's what this is, the Association for Businesses in China. Businesses in China, and they're opposing it. So they've got a basic choice to make here. Not just that organization, but any organization and any company. It's a real simple choice. You can choose national security in a common sense way to do that in a bipartisan amendment, or you can just choose profits in places controlled by foreign adversaries. It's a real simple choice. This is not complicated. They will try to make it complicated, but it's not. Let me start to address some of their arguments. I mentioned earlier that the industry says that covered products are defined, quote, in a vague way. A vague way, that's what they say. That's not true. We provide specifics on personal protective equipment, medical equipment that are goods that are critical to the electricity grid or disaster preparedness. And we expect a robust rulemaking process. Everyone knows that. When you pass a bill like this or a policy like this, rulemaking follows. We specifically and clearly state that rulemaking needs to provide specifics for firms to understand what and when, what they need to disclose and when they need to disclose it. We limit review exclusively to foreign adversaries like China and Russia. If a U.S. firm is offshoring critical capacities to a foreign adversary, the U.S. government should know about it. But again, that only applies to outbound investment to foreign adversaries. We're not talking about outbound investment to Germany. We're not talking about outbound investment to Canada or Australia. We're talking about China and Russia here. So we took business comments and we took edits from business groups around the country. We tried to ensure it was specific to threats while also providing flexibility for the administration to adapt and to adjust. So what is big business really opposing? They're opposing better visibility on when they offshore these critical capacities to in this case, a Chinese Communist Party, a communist country, who happens to be a foreign adversary on so many areas of our bilateral relationship. They're opposing better visibility on engagement with a government that is involved in gross human rights abuses and forced labor and oppression of its people. The old expression, sunlight is the best disinfectant, applies here. Why would we allow a United States company to take an action that compromises our national security and disaster preparedness? So we engage in good faith in taking reasonable comments from these big business associations. Businesses offshoring critical capacities to foreign adversaries should be everyone's concern, not just the concern of 6 senators in the Senate and some others who have spoken in favor. Big name brand companies don't want their names attached to this effort. That's why they're hiding behind their trade associations. But I want to be clear with them and clear to those who are listening. We know who you are. We know what companies are behind this, and we know what you're doing. And I'm going to continue to work to pass this amendment, or if it ends up in a bill form, we're going to pass it. Because we're going to take steps here in the United States Senate in a bipartisan fashion to protect U.S. national security in this fashion. We're not going away. So if these business groups think they're making progress today, we're going to defeat you. So just get ready for it, because we're going to defeat you. Now I'll hold some comments that I was going to make about some others who are opposing this. I'll limit my comments today. Madam President, I want to just conclude with this thought. A lot of members of this body talk really tough about China. They act tough with China. They give a lot of speeches. You know, there's a lot of hot air about China. They go on television and talk about it. But then sometimes when it comes to taking on big interests, they cut and run. I would hope that those 3 Republican senators aren't the only senators on their side who are willing to stand up for this critical national security issue. Again, it's a real simple choice. It's national security or getting profits at the mercy of a Chinese Communist Party. So we're asking for a vote on this amendment, and Madam President, I would yield the floor.